Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening. Great to have your company as always. Here's what's coming up tonight on Credlin. Worryingly, Labor looks set to pander to pro-Palestinian activists, breaking decades-long bipartisanship by signalling they're willing to acknowledge Palestinian statehood. Now, this is domestic politics influencing foreign policy, and even worse, it looks like we're going to reward terrorists. Big news out of the UK with the author of a landmark review into gender medicine and children, concluding it's built on, quote, shaky foundations. Now, this vindicates so many of the brave experts who have spoken up. The problem is, what will it change, if anything, in Australia? Plus, Bill Shorten talks tough when it comes to convicted criminals receiving generous NDIS packages. However, if you know how the system works, you also know he's powerless to stop it unless the states agree. And more proof that the left have contempt for the will of the voter, with the Victorian Labor government pushing ahead with a treaty. But what makes matters worse is this push to exempt Indigenous Australians from land tax, council rates, stamp duty, university fees and more. And it's a move that the Victorian Premier refuses to rule out.
We know hasn't shifted the dial enough to provide more supports for Aboriginal Victorians to address the centuries-old inequality that they experience as a result of colonisation, and be deeply disrespectful of me to cut across those negotiations before they've even started.
I'll come back to that a little later in the show, because what happens in the hard left petri dish of Victoria ends up in every other state. But first, Australia has long supported a two-state solution to the Palestinian issue, but with this vital qualification that any Palestinian state must recognise Israel's right to exist behind secure borders. That's the problem with Penny Wong's rogue proposal to unilaterally recognise Palestine and to mandate an immediate ceasefire with Hamas, still in control of much of Gaza. Effectively, it rewards Hamas for its barbaric assault on October 7 and hands a massive victory to a terrorist group totally pledged to the complete and utter destruction of Israel and a new genocide of Jews from the river to the sea. Indeed, that offensive genocidal phase is still being used by the pro-Palestinian lobby in Australia as recently as last week. Nasser Mashini is the president of the Australia-Palestine Advocacy Network. And this post on the 2nd of April proudly declares, get out, get loud and be proud, 6 months since the genocide began. 6 months since the genocide began. Now, that's a clear attempt to infer that Israel started this war without provocation, when we know it was Israel that was attacked and her 1,200 innocent civilians murdered, that triggered, at international law, Israel's right to self-defence.
Zionists want us to feel hopeless. The images we've seen from Al-Shifa have devastated us all. Gaza won't give up, neither must we. This weekend we march and we rally again. 6 months of genocide must stop. We are winning. The facade of civility that Israel has sold to the world has been shattered. It is impossible to defend this genocide, and those doing so are far less comfortable than ever before. There is a real and powerful anger, not just here but globally, at what Zionism is doing to Palestinians. Our job is to direct and focus that energy until this cruel and genocidal ideology comes to an end. Find your rally this weekend. Be there, get loud, get proud. From the river to the sea, my friends, Palestine will be free. And don't forget, Francesca sends her love.
The genocide is slaughtering on October 7 men, women, children, old people, babies, in the name of religion. Now, ask yourself this question. If a terrorist group from New Zealand, say, had butchered without mercy over 3,000 Australians and taken more than 600 of us hostage, because that's what it would be on a proportionate basis, well, would we be squeamish about a retaliation that potentially involved the risk of civilian casualties, especially if the terrorists were deliberately hiding behind civilians because civilian deaths were always part of the terrorist plan to undermine and ultimately destroy the Jewish state. Now, I doubt we would, because Australians would rightly demand their government do whatever they could in their power to protect Australians. Every civilian death is regrettable. Every civilian death is a death that lawful soldiers and good governments wish did not happen. But sober heads must prevail. We must all understand that in war, dreadful things happen, and that more often than not, mistakes are made. Now, do you think there were no civilians ever killed in error by Australian troops in war? Even in recent conflicts in Afghanistan, in Iraq, when chasing down Islamic State, civilian lives were lost. Regrettable, yes. Unexpected, sadly, no. But that is very different than what happened on October 7, when a terror organisation crossed into another country to slaughter its civilians in cold blood quite deliberately in order to spark the retaliation in the conflict we're all watching now. It was Palestinians that refused to allow Israelis to live safely behind secure borders. But yet Penny Wong now expects Israel to put down its arms and give the Palestinians a safe nation state, the right to exist that the Arabs have never given Israel. Penny Wong's intervention in this debate last night smacks of rank politics.
One is that the government actually has no intention of following through and prematurely recognising unilaterally a Palestinian state, in which case Penny Wong is irresponsibly playing to a domestic political audience on a hugely sensitive international security issue, or they genuinely do intend to break with decades of bipartisan policy in Australia on Israel-Palestine.
And look, Wong's intervention is not just about the politics of the hard left who have all come to hate Israel, but also the brutal politics of vote chasing inside Labor, where there's nothing they will not do, no principle they'll not squander to get and hold power. If you listen to the Albanese government, you would think that Israel was denying the loss of the 7-8 workers. Now, nothing could be further from the truth. 2 Israeli officers found guilty of failing to follow standard procedures that resulted in these drone strike deaths, well, they've already been sacked. And many may well also be criminally charged by the Israelis themselves. Indeed, Israel has been far quicker than we've ever been to investigate and take action against possible war crimes. As the whole Brereton process has shown, we take years to admit there might have been a problem. And we take even more years to investigate it. Then we take years more again to assess it. And even now, we're leaving accused Australian soldiers in a legal limbo. Arguably, that's an injustice. And that's where we are. And yet we criticise Israel. Why is the accidental killing of an Australian aid worker that's produced an almost immediate apology and deep contrition from the Israelis an enormity, especially when you set it against the way Australia has handled what were allegedly deliberate killings by our own military? Now, just as bad is the Prime Minister's double standard when it comes to our own killed in this latest Middle East conflict. Where was the phone call from the Prime Minister to his Israeli counterpart when the Australian Gilad Carboni was slaughtered by Hamas operatives on October 7? Why did Wong refuse to visit the scene of her murder when she was in Israel in January? Why is one accidental death at the hands of the Israeli military a justification for upending years of bipartisan support for Israel when a deliberate murder by Hamas sparked no outrage or specific outrage from the government? Again, the only explanation is Labor's double standard, that an accidental killing by Israel is a monstrosity, but a deliberate killing by Hamas is just what we'd expect from a terror group. Now, I get that the government can readily protest to the Israelis in a way it can't to Hamas, and that Israelis take our protests seriously in ways that Hamas never will. Still, a moral standard that's not equally applied, well, that's no moral standard at all. And this has everything to do with politics, almost nothing to do with any real moral failing by the Israeli state. The fact that the Foreign Minister, seemingly with the support of other senior ministers, has seized upon this tragic mistake as a justification for giving the enemies of Israel a massive propaganda victory shows 2 things. First, that current ministers in the government, either from the perceived electoral politics of Western Sydney or from a Marxist sympathy, the hard left love this, with supposedly oppressed people who can do no wrong against their supposed oppressors, no longer accepts that there's much moral difference between Israel and Hamas, even though one is a terror group and the other is the only liberal democracy in the Middle East. And the second, that this government is incapable of maintaining a consistent position for more than a couple of weeks. In the aftermath of October 7, the Albanese government was clear. They said this was a Hamas attack and an atrocity, that hostages must be returned and that Hamas must be destroyed. Now it's Israel, they say, that needs to be punished because it's been unable to avoid the civilian casualties that are inevitable in urban warfare and that Hamas has exacerbated. The Israeli government's made a dreadful mistake in the prosecution of a just war. Fair enough. By contrast, the Australian government is guilty of moral posturing to play politics. There is no other Western nation prepared to recognise a Palestinian state as Australia appears ready to do. And the race to recognise a new country run by a listed terrorist organisation, well, by God, that is not a race Australia should ever want to win. It's been a big day right around the country. Let's go to Canberra now for the headlines. Sky News political reporter Trudy McIntosh.
The Foreign Minister has signalled Australia could recognise Palestine as a state in a bid to secure peace in the Middle East. Penny Wong argues international recognition could help build momentum.
So I say to you, a two-state solution is the only hope of breaking the endless cycle of violence.
The opposition argues fast-tracking statehood only rewards Hamas's actions on October 7.
If you come out and say the solution to this is an independent Palestinian state, you're simply rewarding the actions of terrorists.
And a decision like this by Australia, watched from that region, will be seen, I believe, only as emboldening the terrorists.
I have been clear that Hamas has no role in the future of Gaza and that Hamas must release hostages. What I'm talking about is what is the long-term pathway to peace.
Penny Wong's intervention follows growing international efforts, including from the United Kingdom, to recognise a Palestinian state.
Penny Wong is irresponsibly playing to a domestic political audience on a hugely sensitive international security issue.
Penny Wong's speech last night was unilateral and it was a break from the bipartisan consensus on a two-state solution.
Nothing has changed in Australian government position of support for a two-state solution.
The competition watchdog will be given stronger powers to stop companies from gobbling up their rivals without scrutiny.
This is the biggest change to our merger laws in something like 50 years.
Under the proposal from 2026, the ACCC will have to be notified about planned mergers and examine whether they reduce competition.
With this change, we will see the mergers that matter.
Mergers can be a force for good in our economy, but there is a minority that concern us.
Big businesses will have to pay fees of up to $100,000 to the watchdog to have their deals scrutinised.
When you have a good merger, that enables an efficiency to be delivered that can ultimately reduce costs for consumers.
Trudy McIntosh, Sky News, Canberra.
Right, let's get across all of those headlines. Sky News senior reporter Carolyn Marcus joins me, and senior fellow at the Menzies Research Centre, Nick Cater. Welcome to you both. I want to start with this new survey today from the CSIRO that says Australians are more concerned about cheaper and more reliable power than they are about switching to renewables. Close to half of all respondents say they prioritise more affordable energy and the minimisation of power outages ahead of reducing carbon emissions. Now, in a double blow to Labor, close to a quarter of those surveyed say they would refuse to live anywhere near all these new transmission lines needed to connect renewables to the grid. And of course, to Nick, on the issue of solar and wind farms, I mean, these transmission lines are going to cost us around $100 billion. And I tell you, you get out into these regional communities, I am hard pressed to find anyone out there who are willing to support the rollout. And I think this is where the pushback has started, and it's also making a political impact.
Indeed, and I think this just shows once again that the government, that Anthony Albanese and Chris Bowen really are out of touch with ordinary people, because I'm not surprised by those results, by the way, Peter. I don't think you are too, that people say that cheap and reliable energy is more important than green or clean energy. I mean, that people want cleaner energy, for sure, but that of the three, those are the two priorities. And they can see they're not getting them under this government. Of course, there's other cost of living pressures. I think this is going to become an increasing issue. On the transmission lines, on the reactions to people living near transmission lines, this is a disaster for the government. You know, they were hoping to go out and campaign against Peter Dutton and nuclear energy by saying, would you like one of these in your backyard? Well, you know, the backyard for a nuclear power station is very small. With a small modular reactor, we're talking about a site of maybe 18 hectares. And yet these transmission lines and solar farms and wind developments are covering vast swathes of the Australian countryside, cutting through multiple electorates and just annoying a whole lot of people. I think this is a big problem politically for Labor, but it's also a problem in terms of their plan, because unless you get the transmission lines going, the whole thing falls to pieces, as it is in the United States, by the way, and people will stop investing in wind and solar because they have no hope of ever connecting them to the grid.
And let's not forget too, I mean, the reality is the Albanese government is just got a very, very slim margin. I mean, they won the election with around 32 or 33% of the primary vote. That is very, very low. And few governments at their first election after a win improve that position. So the sense would be there will be an accretion or a loss of that vote. And when things are tight in these outer suburban areas in regional Australia, that makes it even more difficult for the government to hang on to the seats it has. Let's go to those two major developments last night, the Bruce Lehrmann defamation case, Caroline. We mentioned them briefly last night. The first, that we are going to get a judgment on Monday morning. Well, hallelujah. I really need a break from the circus. It seems to go on every single day. The second, this new statement to the court from Brittany Higgins, where she questions the possibility that she might have been drugged on the night of the alleged rape at Parliament House. An entry, this was in a chronology from an AFP officer. Now, it's also in her statement, she mentions her $2.4 million Commonwealth payment. Now, that's interesting in itself. What can you tell us?
That's right, Peter. Well, Brittany Higgins has made some interesting submissions there to the court. She was invited to do so by the judge in order to address some of the accusations that had been made, the attacks on her credibility from Bruce Lehrmann in his submissions. And in these submissions, she addresses that multi-million-dollar payout that she received from the government. She said that the circumstances around her payout had not been explored in evidence in any meaningful way. She said that she wasn't cross-examined about the payout itself, so she didn't really have the right opportunity to explain her understanding of its terms. She was criticised for giving false evidence under oath about the payout, including that it was made that the government had made admissions that they had failed in its duty of care when it emerged, when we finally saw the details of this deed that was released by the court, that it was made on a no admissions basis, that the government absolutely did not admit any liability. Ms. Higgins's lawyer wrote, it would be grossly unfair for any allegations concerning the deed to be used against Ms. Higgins. He said she was not a lawyer. She shouldn't be presumed to be able to understand a complex formal document. And so to say that she was dishonest because she'd given that false evidence would be without basis. Also, they mentioned this master chronology that you cite. That was a note that was given by a senior AFP officer that came out as a matter of this affidavit that was filed by the former Spotlight producer, in which that officer says, I have concerns from info I heard that this may have happened before or could happen again. I was referring to info that the alleged victim may have been drugged. Now, that note was made after a meeting between the officer and the then Defence Minister Linda Reynolds and her Chief of Staff Fiona Brown. Brittany Higgins had never gone to the doctor following the assault. We learned the alleged assault. We learned that during the criminal trial. And her lawyers are now saying that the potential that she may have been drugged was not raised or explored in the defamation trial, and she wishes she had the opportunity to explore it further. And that could be a possible reason, if she was drugged, why her memory of the event may not have been so perfect. So interesting things raised in those submissions, but we'll find out a lot more when the judgment is finally handed down Monday morning.
And of course, we're going to run it live here on Sky News. If you're up for it, 10:15 on Monday, please tune in. We'll, of course, cover all the analysis tonight on Monday night at 6 on Credlin. OK, let's go to one of Labor's key boasts, Nick Cater. This is about job creation. They say that 1,220 jobs are created every day by the government, and that's the highest of any government and almost double the daily average across 9 years of Liberal governments. But there's analysis that says if you compare Labor's first 21 months in office with the Morrison government's last 20 months in office, that's not right. The coalition is in fact in front in terms of job creation. And what's more, Angus Taylor, he's the Shadow Treasurer, says that the population increases, the massive spike in our migration under Labor, actually undermines their claim. Who's right here, Nick?
Well, if you're bringing in 500,000 people a year or more, which is what Labor has been doing, well, you've got to create a lot more jobs than that in order to create employment for Australians as well as new migrants. No, I think Angus Taylor is right. I'm being caught a bit short on this, Peter. I'm going to go away and do the figures later, but I just say one thing, and that is that any increase in jobs, and sure, the economy is doing better than a lot of economies around the world. I think we've got to give some credit to Scott Morrison and Josh Frydenberg for that. If you remember, they spent the money during COVID deliberately in a way that would keep businesses running and people in jobs so that we could have a V-shaped recovery. So that's exactly what has happened, and I don't think Chalmers and Albanese can claim any credit for that. So, you know, on this thing about how many jobs, in the end, voters will decide on how they feel about this. They feel about their wages aren't going so far. They're having to work harder. Two people are having to work in one family when possibly only one would really like to. You know, these are the things. I don't think number games like this are really going to save Labor.
Look, I agree with you on that point. I think sometimes that the spin is what people really want to walk away from in a campaign, and they look at home and half and how they actually feel in the ballot box. Monday night, I spoke with Sal Grover. She's the founder of the female-only app called Giggle. Now, she's been slapped with a discrimination lawsuit after a transgender woman, Roxanne Tickle is her name, was denied access to the app. The case, of course, before the federal court as we speak. And there's now an evolutionary biologist being called to give evidence that's, quote, objectively and scientifically reasonable for Ms Grover to identify the plaintiff as being of the male species. We see this play out, Caroline, in the same week that we've got the Mona Gallery in Tasmania forced to allow men to enter its ladies' lounge after a successful discrimination suit brought by a man. This is the front line for women's rights in Australia at the moment.
It's incredible, isn't it, that we're living in this Orwellian dystopia where the exclusion of women from their own spaces is happening under this cover of so-called inclusion. It's crazy. So the Museum of Old and New Art in Tasmania, which I've visited, this lounge, this ladies' lounge, wasn't created until 2020. So sadly, I missed out on that experience because it sounds amazing. Apparently, there's a male butler to tend to the ladies and you get a champagne on arrival. I definitely would have indulged in that experience. But this man has launched this case that he says he was discriminated against because upon paying his $35 fee to enter the museum, he wasn't allowed into this lounge. Now, I think there's a slight difference to the Roxanne Tickle case that you mentioned because I don't believe this person identifies as a woman. It's just a man saying he should be allowed into a woman's space. But I dare say we are entering this new era where men and women cannot have separate spaces, which I think would be a shame.
Yes, and it was the feminists who led the charge, saying there was a right for a woman's room of her own. And now that's all wound back. It's Virginia Woolf, as we know. Nick Cater, thank you. Caroline Marcus, great to have your company as always. Let's go down to this landmark review that's just come out in the UK into gender, medicine and children that makes concrete so many of the concerns the mental health and medical fraternity have expressed for years, despite attempts by activists to shout them down. The review, commissioned by the National Health Service in the UK and conducted by a former president of the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health, Dr. Hilary Cass, has rejected the use of puberty blockers for children wanting to change their gender. Now, Cass has even gone as far as to say that the entire field of medicine aimed at children changing their gender was, and I quote, built on shaky foundations. For more, I'm joined now by the journalist at the Gender Clinic News, the wonderful Bernard Lane. Well, we've discussed the lead up to this review on a number of occasions, Bernard, starting, of course, with the closure of the Tavistock Clinic. Just how significant is Cass's review for the practice of gender medicine?
Yes, Peter, I think it's potentially very significant. Her review is relevant internationally. What has happened is that the gender clinics have introduced treatments, puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, as routine before they had good evidence showing that the benefits outweigh the risks. When you recognise the reality of that situation, that children are being given experimental interventions, what do you do? And this is the question that Hilary Cass is trying to answer. And her solution is to try to normalise this area of gender medicine and try to return it to a mainstream, holistic mental health approach.
I found it extraordinary to see that, you know, as part of her review, she looked into 53 previously published studies on hormone treatments in young people, and all but one study, and she found this, and you know, she's a doctor with paediatric expertise, only one study, she said, looked at the side effects, and the rest of those studies were rated as moderate or low in quality. Now, why is this only being acknowledged now?
Well, that's from a systematic review that was carried out for the Cass inquiry. Systematic review is the gold standard for assessing the quality of evidence said to support a treatment. That systematic review confirms the results of several systematic reviews internationally now. In Finland and Sweden, for example, they have all looked at the evidence for puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones given to kids with gender distress, and they've all independently come to the same conclusion, that the evidence base is very weak and uncertain.
She said in her recommendations too that in most instances a medical pathway wasn't necessary, and that children must be seen as a whole person, not just through the lens of their gender identity. Now, we do that. If a child presents with anorexia, we treat them holistically. We don't tell them that just because they say that they're fat, we look at them and we say, no, you're not. We go down through a whole process of mending the entire person. But we don't do this with gender.
That's right, Peter. The concern is that at the Tavistock Gender Clinic, for example, once a child had raised the issue of gender, then that became the focus. The idea of reform is to try to get clinicians who have a much broader approach and who will not simply take the trans declaration of a child at face value, but will investigate whether there are other issues underlying it. It might be autism, it might be depression, it might be a history of sex abuse or family trauma or difficulty in accepting same-sex attraction. So the idea is to try to get a proper holistic mainstream focus on all the issues that are affecting these kids who come forward saying that their problem is gender.
There's 32 recommendations in the report to overhaul the system in the UK. Now, what stands out as the most significant of these for you? And while I know it's early, but the chances of them getting adopted, given that the UK has really gone hard, Bernard, and not just the UK, there are other Scandinavian countries as well, to wind back this whole gender affirmation push that was really hard and fast for about 10 years. Where do you think the UK is going to go here?
That's very difficult to say, Peter. The Cass report is written in very tactful, careful language because Cass knows that to bring about this reform in therapeutic culture, if you like, she has to carry along many existing clinicians who are committed to the ideological gender-affirming treatment model. So, I mean, it's a horrendous dilemma. Cass recognises that much of the problem is a problem of workforce training. Our universities have become captured by gender-affirming ideology. They are turning out future clinicians who are not going to have the broad focus that Cass says is necessary. One quite striking fact was that the existing adult gender clinics refused to cooperate with the Cass review to give data to try to improve the quality of the evidence for treatments. They refused to cooperate. This is the environment in which Cass is having to try to push towards some kind of reform. She's getting reasonably strong support, it seems, from the Tory government in the UK. But if the next government is a Labor government, that support can't be taken for granted because trans activism and the gender-affirming model appear to have more support among Labor.
Oh, it's the same here. I mean, I've got to ask you the question. I mean, you get a report like this. We've had a House of Lords inquiry in the United Kingdom. We've had the closure of Tavistock. You know, you've got 53 reports, she says, out there, and only one is of moderate. Sorry, or there's 53 reports out there. 52 of them, in terms of medical quality, expert quality, are low to moderate. Only one is worth anything much at all. They've at least had that inquiry, they've had that review, they've looked into the data. We can't even get a parliamentary inquiry up in this country, Bernard. Are we getting closer with this Cass review now in the UK to opening up the door here in Australia to a fair income expert inquiry into what we're doing to our children?
I think, Peter, the recent history of our governments, of our health bureaucracies, our hospitals, our medical organisations, they have all been committed to an uncritical expansion of gender-affirming care, of access to puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones. However, as a kind of a minor theme to that, there's an increasing number of individual politicians, both state and federal, who understand the nature of the problem and who have been pushing for some kind of inquiry. And that will continue. It's interesting that there was a request for a national inquiry from Dr. Philip Morris of the National Association for Practising Psychiatrists, and there was a somewhat encouraging comment from the Federal Shadow Coalition spokeswoman for health. So the question is when a major party in Australia will embrace a policy to have a proper national inquiry into gender clinics, because our gender clinics are giving the puberty blockers as routine treatments, which will no longer be available as routine in England.
You are being polite there, Bernard. What you're saying in simple terms is the Libs have got to get off the fence. They've got to take a position here and they should be on the right side of medical history, expert history, obviously, and children. I'll leave it there. Thank you for your time. Thank you for keeping us right across what's happening in the UK. All right, after the break, Greg Sheridan, I want his reaction on this move that Labor looks like they'll recognise a Palestinian state. It breaks decades of bipartisanship. So what's it mean for foreign policy moving forward? Plus, a bit later on, I mean, Bill Shorten's talking tough when it comes to crims on the NDIS, but I'll tell you why it's a wet lettuce in a moment. Welcome back. Still to come, those shocking demands in Victoria that could see Indigenous Australians exempt from land tax, stamp duty, uni fees, council rates and more. The Victorian Premier today refused to rule them out. But first, let's return to Penny Wong's push for Labor to consider recognising Palestinian statehood. She made the comments at a scripted speech last night at the ANU, and then she reiterated the message this morning, supported later in the day by the Prime Minister. But here's analysis on what this means at every level, internationally, domestically, and amongst our allies. I'm joined now by the foreign editor at The Australian, Greg Sheridan. Well, Greg, give us your top-line view. I mean, I thought this was an extraordinary move by Penny Wong. There are decades of bipartisanship on this position about a two-state solution. Give us your sense of what you heard from the Foreign Minister last night and then, I guess, being backed in today by the Prime Minister.
Well, Peter, I was profoundly disappointed in this speech. I've had a lot of respect and admiration for Penny Wong previously. But this speech, although it was carefully worded, there's a kind of undergraduate silliness to the speech. It's as if she's the first person who's ever discovered a two-state solution. And she has a Pollyanna talk about it as though you could just impose it tomorrow. And the only thing stopping it is the wicked unreasonableness of those Israelis. And it's also a deeply, deeply cynical speech. This is designed, if Albanese had won The Voice, he would have been the superhero of the left forevermore, the greatest constitutional reformer in the history of the Labor Party. If he recognises Palestine, he will go to the election with an unassailable position amongst Muslim activists who care about Palestine and not anything else. And he will fortify himself against the Greens, whereas the most likely outcome at the next election is that the Liberals swipe a couple of seats from him, but the Greens swipe a few seats from him and he goes into minority government. Now, that can be the only explanation. This motion on the Labor Party books to recognise Palestine has been on the books for years. And it's one of those motions which the government knows is utterly ridiculous. And therefore, rather than fight the left over it, they just include a weasel word about, when the timing is appropriate or something. Now, what Penny Wong has done is she has validated Hamas's tactics. Hamas goes and kills 1,200 Jews, commits the worst terrorism that we've seen in modern times. And the result is the Australian Foreign Minister is calling for immediate diplomatic recognition of a Palestinian state. Well done, the terrorists. Very bad effort by the Australian Foreign Minister. Although, having said all that, Australia acting alone won't make a bit of difference, except that it demoralises, it marginally demoralises our friends in Israel. And of course, it profoundly distresses the Jewish community and all friends of Israel in Australia. But the government couldn't seem to care less about that.
It's interesting. I've written about this for The Australian tomorrow, and I refer to the speech as having a Pollyanna ideal from the Foreign Minister. So we're on the same page there. But I mean, this is absolutely brutally not just about the Muslim vote in Western Sydney. This is about the Greens. This is exactly what this is designed to do, to cleave off some of that vote that they're using, particularly with young people, to the Greens. Rather than contest the false premise put up about Israel and many other things by the Greens, Labor doesn't want to touch that. They don't trust themselves or believe themselves enough to defend old Labor values. They're now just joining the Greens or trying to beat the Greens at their own game. And this is why it's just rank politics and it stinks.
Well, I agree with you, Peter. I think this is the government has gone bad on security, started off very good on security. And, my column pays on results. I don't care what political party anybody's in. They start off very good on security and they've gone worse and worse and worse as the months have gone on. Now, it is true. A majority of nations do recognise a Palestinian state, but that's because at the United Nations you've got an Afro-Arab majority which is profoundly inimical to democracy and adopts all kinds of positions in the General Assembly which are repugnant to democratic values. Now, for a state actually to come into being, so of course Palestine doesn't satisfy all the criteria you need to be recognised as a state. Control of territory, undisputed territory, clear, coherent national government, all that. So that's all rubbish. Everything which DFAT has previously said is needed. So Penny Wong's just thrown that in the trash can. All the Palestinian vetoes which make it impossible, such as the right of return for millions and millions and millions of Palestinian descendants to go and live in Israel proper, which the Palestinians regard as a precondition for them even coming to the talks. No mention of that. No, that's all just forget about that. All blame goes to Israel. But for a state actually to come into existence, the Security Council has to vote on it. And the governing resolutions at the Security Council, which any decent Australian government should seek to uphold, regard these territories as disputed territories. The last clear sovereignty of the West Bank and Gaza was exercised by the Ottoman Empire. They're disputed territories, and of course, everyone wants a two-state solution eventually. But there is simply no way that the Palestinian polity can govern a state which would guarantee internal self-government and refrain from deadly terrorist attacks on Israel from day one. Now, Israel, the first two-state solution was the United Nations partition of the territory in 1947. The Palestinians rejected that, and all the neighbouring Arab armies invaded Israel. And at least 3 times since then, Israel has offered a Palestinian state with virtually all of the West Bank and Gaza, tiny bit kept for Israel, but compensating land from Israel proper, and the Palestinians have never come to the party. Don't believe me on it? Read Bill Clinton's memoirs or the memoirs of all of those, extreme right-wingers who served in the Bill Clinton administration. Now, Penny Wong, I suspect, knows all this because she's a smart person, but she simply delivered a jeune undergraduate nonsense lecture as though she just discovered a two-state solution. But it had I'm just back from New Zealand, it had a Jacinda Ardern quality about it. It was just woke gesturing to a left-wing sectarian audience. That's what's so disappointing about it.
I got to leave you there, Greg. I didn't interrupt, though, because you're the best in the business, and that was absolutely nailing what has been, I think, a really dark day for Australian foreign policy today. Thank you, as always. And after the break, despite the absolute thumping last year in The Voice, Victoria is heading towards a treaty, and some of the stuff that Aboriginal Victorians will be exempt from paying will shock you. Plus, Kell Richards a little later. Kell coming out, we've got some good words. Autistic, we'll get into that one, but let's bring in my panel first. Shadow Environment Minister Senator Jonathan Duniam and columnist with The Spectator, Terry Barnes. Well, gents, welcome. I want to start with the NDIS, $42 billion and climbing, more than we spend on defence. That's where the forecast is headed. We learned this week that a whole raft of pedophiles and convicted criminals get the NDIS, some on packages worth over $1 million. John O'Daniam, I was not aware this was happening. It is shocking.
Shocking is an understatement, Peter. I mean, the government tell us that funding for the program is unsustainable and we've got a rein in costs, yet here we are handing money out to individuals who are probably some of the worst in society committing crimes of this nature. The program is there to support vulnerable Australians who need help, who genuinely need help to get by. That was the original intent. So if we're talking about saving money, I would argue that the government could actually have a look at some of the recipients here who are well now known to the government and make those savings. It is well out of step with community expectation. And Bill Shorten, the minister, the bloke who can make decisions, should make some decisions. There are some savings right there.
Yeah, well, he's not making decisions. I mean, he is the guy that was the architect with Julia Gillard of the scheme in the first place. He's now the minister who says he wants to reform it. I haven't seen much reform, Terry. Fair enough, the way it's constructed, the way he designed it, the states have got the whip hand, but all he's done on the back of these reports is write to the states saying, don't use the NDIS as the dumping ground for your violent criminals. Fine. I don't know what a letter's going to do. I want to see some action. Can he take action, or do all the states have to agree?
Well, Peter, I think criminal justice is a state responsibility. I mean, the responsibility for these convicted murderers and sex offenders is a state responsibility. They should not be handballing it to the federally funded NDIS. End of story. And this is morally repugnant. So if it's a question of a legislative loophole here, let the feds, let the Albanese government fix it pronto, because I think Australians have a right to feel safe at home, and it's not right for those states to free ride on what the federal government pays for.
You're right to say it can be fixed legislative, Terry. That's a very good point. And Parliament, of course, is back when the budget is delivered in May. Let's see if something happens there. And Jono, that's where the pressure's got to come from your mob in the coalition. What did you make of this push from the Victorian Aboriginal lobby? This is all around the voice in Victoria, the treaty in Victoria, despite woke Victoria voting against the voice. Well, Jill Gallagher, she's a prominent Aboriginal elder. She's caused a bit of outrage today. She says the treaty should include exemptions for Aboriginal people. She doesn't want them to pay land taxes, stamp duty, council rates. She wants kids to get free university. And today the Victorian Premier would not rule this out. Senator Duniam.
Oh, well, she should rule it out. It's the right thing to do. What is it about the left? They proposed this voice as the answer to all problems faced by Aboriginal Australians. It would have done nothing but create two classes of people in this country based on race. Now we have someone proposing, and perhaps backed in by the Labor government in Victoria, to exempt people from paying taxes based on race. I agree with people like Jacinta Price and Warren Mundine who know a thing or two about this, and it is a bad idea. What I'd love to know is the Victorian government going to extend this silliness to denying these people who don't pay these taxes based on race access to these services too? I mean, where do we stop this division? It's bad policy.
That's a very good point. If you don't want to pay the taxes, well, you don't get any of the services. You don't get the Medicare, you don't get the education, you don't get the roads, you don't get all the things, Terry Barnes, that our taxes, as much as we don't like paying them, actually provide for the nation state.
Absolutely. Look, Premier Allen should stamp on this pronto. This is inverse racism, Peter. Paying for tax is the duty of all citizens, regardless of colour, regardless of social status, regardless of anything. It is not some sort of price for paying for white privilege. So I think the Premier should just absolutely end this once and for all straight away.
Jono, Ken Henry, who you and I will well remember as I regard a quite left head of Treasury, and he did the Henry Review, the tax review that went nowhere. He now chairs the Australian Climate and Biodiversity Foundation. He wants the federal government to set up what he calls a nature repair market connected to carbon credits. Now, how on earth would this operate, and what do you think of the idea?
Well, Ken Henry, as you rightly point out, we recall he, as Secretary of Treasury, is one of those Australians who think the government is the answer to everything. I disagree on this basis. There is a nature repair market that has been legislated. The Labor Party and the Greens got together and rammed a bill through the Senate in recent months, and it's going nowhere. So he's come in and said, we need to prop it up with some taxpayer dollars. Well, if it's such a cracker scheme and we need to get it going, I'm sure the private sector will step in. What the government could actually do is do what they promised they'd do 2 years ago, deliver legislation to replace the EPBC Act as they promised they would have in Parliament by the end of next year. Instead, we have nothing. And I look forward to telling your viewers in a future program of yours, Peter, exactly what the coalition's going to do to improve our investment status in the world through better environmental laws. That's what the government could do, not prop up a scheme like Ken Henry's proposed.
Yeah, I think I'm about to lose you. Just quickly, Terry, we've got Stephen Jones at a federal level saying he's not going to answer questions about the $61,000 he spent on Comcars. This is to drive him around. He's also got a private plated vehicle paid for by the taxpayer. Most of his staff, says the Australian Financial Review, have quit. That says to me he's in a bit of trouble internally. Surely he's got to front taxpayers and explain why he's racked up such a massive bill.
Oh, absolutely. I think it doesn't matter which side of politics you're on, Peter, you actually have to account for your use of taxpayers' money. And one of the reasons that the government said they wanted to be more transparent is actually put these figures out there. So if the Assistant Treasurer is not willing or able to front up and explain why it is that his travel budget was so high and why his staff are treating his office like a revolving door, then he's back to, oh, look, he's wasting everybody's time. Why is he there?
Well, I think the Prime Minister needs a reshuffle. He needs to go, and a few others too, starting with Claire O'Neill and Andrew Giles. Senator Duniam, Terry Barnes, thank you both for your time. Right, let's go now to Kell Richards. He joins me every Wednesday. It's one of my favourite spots in a busy week. I know it's one of yours. Charlotte, Kell, welcome as always. One of our viewers, Charlotte, wants to know where the word autism comes from. We've discussed it quite a bit. We just discussed it then before, talking about transgender children. Of course, it comes up constantly in the NDIS. Where do we get the word autism from?
Well, I'm told it's a developmental disorder, and it was named, the word was coined by a German psychiatrist in 1908. Now, his name is Eugen Bleuler, and I apologise for my non-existent German pronunciation. So I do apologise if I'm pronouncing it wrong. But he coined it because he had a patient who simply could not connect with other people, who couldn't read other people, couldn't form relationships with other people. And so he decided that he'd retreated into himself, this patient, and autos is the ancient Greek word for self. So Bleuler coined the term autism to mean retreating into the self. Now, the thing about it is it happens on a broad spectrum. It's not one thing. So at one end, you've got people who just are insensitive and rude and can't connect with people like Doc Martin on the Foxtel television program. But at the other end, it's really very serious. And you've got children who are non-verbal, who can't even use language at all and struggle with the routine things of life. So it's now a very broad term, but it originally meant a retreat into the self.
Every week I learn something. This one takes me back to, I think, about Year 6 grammar. I come from the age where I actually had a subject in grammar, affect and effect. Anthony wants to know the difference.
Right. It's something we all get confused about and we all forget. Let me tell you, the way to remember this is affect with an A is a verb. It's an action word. It does something. Effect with an E is a noun. It is something. So if that affected me, that's an action. That's spelt with an A. But if I felt the effect, that's a noun. That's a thing. It's spelt with an E. If you can remember, affect with an A is a verb. Affect with an E is a noun. You will get it right. There are some slight more complications about that, but that's enough. If we do it that way, we will get it right, Peter. Does that ring a bell with your old grammar book?
It does, yes, and the nuns used to sort of give you a whack if you got it wrong, so I'm pleased not to get the whack. Hey, wild and woolly. James wants to know, recently we've said the weather in Melbourne in particular, wild and woolly. Where do we get wild woolly from?
From the American West, from the Old West, from the Wild West. The Merriam-Webster Dictionary traced it back to 1884 and a history of the American West. And they said the cowboys and pioneers were described as wild and woolly. The wild part's pretty clear. The woolly part, they think, comes from the fact that they tended to have clothes which were made of sheepskin with the wool still attached to it. So sheepskin jackets, and the Old West could get very cold in the middle of winter. So that's apparently where it comes from. Another researcher, Gary Martin, who's very good at this, thinks he's tracked it back to 1855. But wherever it goes back to, it is certainly from the American Wild West. They were wild and woolly, and we've got the expression from them.
Daryl wants to know, why do we say throw the book at them when someone's appeared in court and the judge, in this case, has thrown the book at them, or the police throw the book at someone? Where do we get that one from?
This is also American, from 1908. This first turned up in American conversation. And as a lawyer, you'll understand this. It's the idea of a judge who picks up the statute book in which all the legislation is recorded and throws the entire statute book at the accused person. So he's charged with everything that's in the book. So it's charging him with everything, throwing the book at him, and it's a statute book. You know, all the law books that are in the law library at every big law firm.
All right, give us a plug where people can get your newsletter and send us more words for next week, Kell.
Ozwords, ozwords.com.au. Go there, you'll get all the newsletters, and there's a contact page. Type out the question for the Credlin program and I'll answer it next week.
Terrific. Thank you, Kell. That's it for me. Busy day tomorrow. It's been a crazy week. I'll see you at 6 o'clock. Here's Andrew Bolt.